Thanks. Thank you so much. The good news is, because of the power outage, which apparently happens all the time in California these days, I'm not going to give my 45-minute speech. Instead, Chris Stewart and I are going to have a conversation to talk about the efforts in Florida and other places, and we welcome you to this summit. One quick thing, because we have about 300 members of legislatures that deal with non-education issues, I hope you take this as a warning of bad policy as it relates to how you regulate power companies. Make sure it's not a partisan statement, but make sure that you allow them to have enough capital in their rate base to be able to do the maintenance work necessary to be able to sustain the reliability of their grid. Thank you. Chris?
That was masterful. That was never let a disaster go to waste. That was really masterful. How exciting it is to be here with you this morning. At top, I would just like to say, acknowledge that there's been no one who's been more clear and consistent about our need for a child-centered education system than you. You're peerless in that regard. So it's really exciting to be in a big room with a big crowd, and it's all because you had big ideas. And not only did you have big ideas, you had the temerity to implement them. And more than anything else, it must be gratifying for you to know that millions of children are going to be better off because of what you've done.
Well, I'm honored to be part of a large group of people that believe the same thing. And this summit is a way for us to nourish kind of our beliefs and to, it gets frustrating in the world we're in now. I think politics has changed since 20 years ago when I got to be governor of the state of Florida. Now, there aren't as many rewards for doing bigger things. In fact, there's real penalties if you try to take risks on behalf of a cause that you believe in. It's so easy to be attacked. And I think the fact that we're gathered here is a counter to that, and I'm excited always to be here for this summit because, look, success is never final, reform is never complete. It requires gladiators, you know, to constantly be changing and pushing forward. We live in a world of incredible change, and we can't stand pat on education because that's the tool that probably the most important thing we can do is assure that kids, you know, are college and/or career ready at the end of a 13-year experience.
So it feels like there's a lot of discussion right now about how tough it is, how the winds have changed, but your A+ plan was pretty radical.
Yeah.
And probably wasn't welcomed by everybody. I mean, you brought in grading schools by letter grades, financial incentives for doing well in schools, vouchers. So as much as we'd like to say that today it's not easy, it couldn't have been easy back then. Could you tell us a little bit about your leadership then?
So in 1994, I ran for governor and lost, leading me to tell young people that are looking, the politicians in the crowd will appreciate this. People come to me saying, you know, they're already made up their mind they're running normally, but they want to come and ask for my advice about it. You ever had that experience? So they come and with sincerity say that I'm thinking about running, you have any advice? And my advice always is to start with is to run against someone who's a bad candidate, you'll have a better chance of winning. Sometimes people skip over that part. And in 1994, I ran against a guy that never lost, and I lost. In 98, I decided to do something different. And I think it's important to talk about this because ideas, typically you can't like have a secret plan to do something big and provocative. You have to actually have the courage of your convictions to go out and defend it. So in 1998, I went to visit 250 schools as a candidate for governor, and I laid out what became the A+ plan for education. And I was the challenger, but actually the education ideas were the dominant part of the campaign. And whether that was the reason I won or not really isn't relevant. I claimed it. You know, that's what you call a mandate, my friends. And then the legislature, cautious about kind of the more radical elements of this, it took some time to get them to go along. Particularly interestingly, the school recognition money where you reward schools for improvement or accountability that was totally transparent, A through F, ending social promotion, the beginnings of that, teacher performance where student performance had to be a key element in evaluating the the capacity of teachers. All those things got very little attention and had bipartisan support because all of the opposition was on one small part, but a really important part of the bill of 400 pages, which was the voucher plan, the Opportunity Scholarship Plan. And we won the day. It was close. It wasn't, was not as popular. It's now, I think, our school choice programs, public and private, are pretty popular in Florida. Back then, it was a pretty radical idea. And there was major pushback. I was with Tracy Richardson, who's in the crowd, who's was one of the first parents to receive a voucher to send their kid to a private school out of a failing public school in Pensacola, Florida. We were talking about this. I showed up the first day of school in September after the bill passed, and this principal was like really mad at me. I mean, I cannot describe how mad. Thank God she was like 5'3" or something. If she was a bigger woman, she would have been beating on me. And she was upset because she thought it was unfair. It was unfair to have the same expectations for her kids, as she called them, as kids maybe in another part of Pensacola. And she went through all this, the cameras were rolling, and then she said, how do you have accountability around students who don't show up for 2 weeks? And I said, well, look, I mean, is that true? Is that really true? I hadn't heard that before. And she said, yeah, it's true. It's unfair. So I said, well, tell you what, let's go get them. So the FDLE, the grumpy principal, and I started knocking on doors to bring people to school. And the point was, look, if you have challenges, then garner the support for people that have big and caring hearts to be able to assure that they have the same chance as a kid that might be in the suburban part of, in Santa Rosa, 20 miles from Pensacola. And it took time to change the mindset, but I think the lesson is you got to say what you're going to do, and then you've got to, with fidelity, do what you said you were going to do. And that's what we did. And it was not easy, and there's still to this day people grumpy about it. But the results are pretty powerful. And the summit is not all about Florida for sure, because there's great things being done in other parts of the country as well. Tennessee has had great gains. This year, Mississippi and Washington, D.C. were the only states that had significant gains.
Very good.
Mississippi, back in 1998, we were 50th out of 50 in high school graduation rate. And we couldn't say, thank God for Whisper, the state that you thought was below, because everybody was whispering, thank God for Florida. Mississippi's always kind of been perceived that way, but they've had lights out improvements because they have been faithful to choices for parents and accountability around every child. And they've begun to blow up the mythology that some kids can learn and some kids can't. And they're putting resources for the things that they want more of. That strategy is being applied across the country with significant improvement in student learning.
What's interesting about your plan, the A+ plan, is that if we were to propose it like in my state right now, everybody would say the sky's going to fall. If you rate schools by grade letters, it's going to make some schools be stigmatized. You're going to hurt kids' self-esteem if you begin social promotion. Testing, so all of these things, and you heard them all, I'm sure. What do you say?
It's sad that that's the defense. It starts, the excuses principally imply what my brother called the soft bigotry of low expectations. And there should be marches in the streets against this. Look, I start from the premise that God, that we're all children of God, and our children have God-given talents, not all the same, but it's up to us around them to assure that they reach their God-given potential. And if you start with that premise, then you can't excuse away anything. Maybe we put more resources. Maybe the debate in state legislatures ought to be, well, if you have struggling students in struggling schools, maybe they should get more resources. Because in many places around the country, the places where kids are thriving, teacher pay is higher because teachers migrate to those schools, or they migrate to the school districts that have higher per student funding. We create this idea that public education is a egalitarian system. It's not at all. Underneath the surface, the funding formulas in many places are designed to perpetuate this inequality that exists. So perhaps that's the way to rebuild the coalition of the left-right, is to say, okay, we're going to have high expectations for everybody. We're going to have real accountability to assure that there's a consequence that's different when children aren't learning. But let's recognize that there are many places where where there's underfunding or their needs are unique and different. It doesn't mean they can't learn. It means that they have challenges that they have to overcome.
So you mentioned the new coalition. You just said that. I heard you say it.
Yeah, we need one.
You know, a couple years ago on this stage, as a matter of fact, I think you talked a little bit about coalitions, and I think you called it the Nixon to China strategy. You would always find somebody who thought differently than you, looked differently, you know, to partner with. That seems really, really impossible right now. It doesn't seem
not impossible.
Realistic. You know?
Not impossible. I think if we open this up to members of the legislature's experience or a governor's experience, it's more often you will find that in a state capital than certainly in Washington. It looks kind of weird. I mean, it's on the margins. Occasionally you'll see something, but anything that's big and substantive, it's an armed camp. I mean, right now, you know, there's like the hearing going on. It's like two alternative universes. The one set of questions implies one set of facts. The others, it's like watching something out of the Twilight Zone. Whereas the best kind of policy making is where, so, you know, you and I probably don't agree on, we may agree on a lot of things, I don't know, but assume that we don't. But
we agree on education.
Exactly, that's my point.
Yeah.
I don't know if we disagree or not, but why would we worry about the things we disagree on? Why don't we focus on the things that we have agreement on and then get people's mindset changed by coming together and saying, we're for this. So the Nixon to China idea is something that I believe every chance you get in terms of policy world, you ought to find someone that may not agree with you on anything else, but on that one subject, they're all in. And share the glory, share the credit, put them, you know, highlight their efforts because it changes people's mentality when they see that. Americans are not in this kind of hyper-partisan armed camp mentality. It's the politicians, and we've outsourced most of what we think about what's going on to DC. We're a bottom-up country. There's very few people in Washington, DC that are in this crowd that are in the policy world. They're in state capitals. They're in school districts. They're doing a lot more work that requires consensus. They have balanced budgets, for crying out loud, that requires, you know, consensus, at least to get out of town, you know. Those are the things that matter a lot. And we kind of keep thinking over and over again, DC defines us. And I would say that's a bad definition of the greatness of our country.
Sounds like, yes, definitely. It sounds like you would say that the real action's at the state, though, the state level.
Education, for sure.
Yeah.
And frankly, any kind of substantive change in our history, if you think about it, other than, we talked about this yesterday at our board meeting, other than big, like put a man on the moon. That was a top-down effort, but it had massive support amongst the American people. Generally, if you try to impose your will on Americans, we kind of rebel against that. And so I think big changes happen by people saying, enough of this, we need to try something different. And so from the perspective of education reform, policy is made at the state level, it's implemented at the local level. It'd be great to have Washington as an ally in all that. It'd be great to have national leaders say this is a national priority, but the actual policy making and implementation has to happen at the state and local level. And it is harder to do unless parents decide that this is important, which is what your work, what you bring to the table, and it's so important.
I care about restoring parents as sovereign in the education. And you say that a lot. You talk about it.
Absolutely. It's like the most important thing.
Yeah.
I mean, look, there are so many well-meaning people in the 13,422 government-run monopolies that define our education system. That governance model is the wrong one for the 21st century, but they're really good people inside those systems. Teachers, principals, administrators, they're all there. But, I mean, how do you compare a well-meaning person to a mom? Who should have the power? I mean, this shouldn't be a big debate, but man, you get death threats if you advocate that too much. And I would trust a mom and a dad every day of the week over a well-meaning, well-intended bureaucrat from afar.
Definitely. You know what's hard about this is I saw the movie for the first time last night, Miss Virginia, saw it here, and it's sad.
She's a great actress, by the way.
Amazing, wasn't it? It makes you sad, but it also makes you angry in some ways when you think about all the hurdles that parents have to overcome to be heard, especially in policy matters. It feels like mass teacher strikes and well-organized, well-funded actions are spooking politicians to not want to touch family empowerment, choice, things that really matter to us. I mean, what would you say?
Yeah, no, it's
to that.
We talked a little bit about this in the national presidential campaign. There are people who have historically been supportive of allowing parents to make choices, perhaps only in public settings, which is fine. But now they've abandoned that because the economic interest of the adults, either they're scared about them or they think that that's a viable thing politically to go forward. And the challenge is in places where scale has already happened, like in New Orleans, Washington, D.C., certainly in Florida, and others in Indiana, where you have scale, where more and more parents have choices. I think Florida, 50% of all kids, their parents choose where they go.
Wow.
So it's we have universal public school choice. We have a growing charter movement. We have the Corporate Tax Scholarship Program, the McKay Scholarship Program, the Gardner Scholarship Program, now a family empowerment program that Governor DeSantis signed into law that is right out of the funding formula. The combination of all that means that you now have a constituency for choice. Mm-hmm. It's very hard for people now to say, we want to take that away. Mm-hmm. So while it may not be as popular politically across the board, every one of those suggestions may not be popular, some are very popular. Once someone has something that they have a value, you cannot take it away.
Right.
And so that's I think the challenge for us is to really focus on how do we create scale so that parents are empowered in a way that unions and politicians and bureaucrats that are concerned that, look, the way districts get funded is 180 days of a little butt in a seat. There, Governor Newsom, thank you. That was very nice of you to turn the light on. Right over there, that's like that one little place.
It's a nonpartisan stage.
So, if parents don't have these choices, and it hasn't been done yet, it's harder. But once you start getting into the momentum of choice, it becomes extraordinarily powerful and popular.
You came to Minnesota and you talked to our legislators in 2011, I think.
Yeah.
2012. Yeah. This is my first time ever seeing you in person.
That was fun.
And yeah, it was great because you put up charts and graphs and you showed, you said basically this is Florida and this is Minnesota, and then you showed how Florida went up over time and how you surpassed Minnesota, which blew people's minds, because we're the North, we feel very superior about these things, right?
Yes, you do.
So you were kind of relitigating history on
behalf of everybody
right?
on the Basin-Dixon line. I agree with your statement.
Yes. And we're pretty resolved about it. So that was a little distressing of a PowerPoint. You said things to these legislators like your AP passage rate, not just taking rate, but passage rate for African Americans and Latino students was 300%, 249%, I think, for Black students, maybe 300 or more. And I thought that would just shock our legislators into action, and that when you left, magic was going to happen. I wonder if you ever think about how you have such a great example in Florida that people don't learn from.
Well, I think a lot of people do. Now, the Minnesota case was interesting because there were a group of basically freshman members that swept in, and then they swept out. Mm-hmm. For those in Minnesota, am I right? It was like there's been back and forth kind of sea changes in the legislative process, and so there hasn't been a sustainable period of time where reform kicks in. This, as we all know, the people that are doing this work know that this is not a check-the-box policy. Mm-hmm. As a former governor, there were things that the box had to be checked on, and I did, and then I went back to education. Mm-hmm. Or sustain environmental policy. There are things that, to be effective, you can't just pass a bill and say, I'm done with it. Education, the legislature has to be faithful and constantly improving when things don't work to tweak it, to make it better. The executive has to be all in on its execution. And so in Minnesota, I think back then at least, there was the desire to do it, but the political winds changed pretty regularly, and frankly, a changing governor also made a difference, if you remember.
Mm-hmm. Yep. and it hasn't gotten
better.
better. So yeah.
We went from some guy named Polini to some guy that did not view this stuff as important. Nice person, seemed like a nice guy, but had no interest.
In Minnesota, we care about nice a lot. Yeah. Yeah. We will nice you to death. We will nice you right into your grave.
Nothing wrong with that, brother.
Nice you into academic oblivion. It just works. It works so well. I want to back up to something that you said because it got caught in my head a little bit. The tension between something like accountability and testing coming from a high level and standards. You've said before, I think in a speech or somewhere I saw you, about how states are playing games with all these different color schemes. Parents are finding
California, what a surprise.
Right, parents are finding it very hard to understand what their states are doing now because of all these weird schemes. But there's a tension there. If you set something like national standards, it kind of takes away the rights of states to set their own.
Yeah, the tension is a couple of places. One, if you don't have any transparency, that's how you avoid the tension. Mm-hmm. Like if mauve is like a grade, and it's different than tangerine color or whatever the favorite colors are in a state. And California actually literally has a kaleidoscope of colors. At least it did. I mean, people don't know what is mauve better than magenta or whatever. I don't even know what those colors are that they have out here. So it hides accountability because it's not transparent. The other tension is, put aside whatever the standards are, you have to assess to those standards. You have to measure with a test. And then policymakers are confronted with a really interesting challenge. Where's the cut score? Mm-hmm. Where's the cut score? Mm-hmm. And that's another place where this is gamed big time. Mm-hmm. In Florida, we've not raised the cut score on our 8th grade test, and so we've seen a decline, I think, because we haven't raised the bar. And the gap between what the NAEP test shows as what proficiency is and what Florida's 8th grade is too high. Many other states have the exact same challenge because it's an easy out. If everybody's above average, back to Minnesota,
Wobegon.
There you go, baby. I mean, who's fooling who?
Yeah.
Who's fooling who? What we need to do is to have, be honest about this and say not everybody's above average. And frankly, we don't have to measure to the median anyway. What we want is a year's worth of knowledge in a year's time where ultimately we have high expectations for every kid, and ultimately they reach those expectations. They reach their God-given ability. You don't do that by lowering cut scores or eliminating accountability or excusing away the mediocrity that may exist because we haven't challenged the system.
You've said we need fewer and better tests.
Yeah. So most states impose a test at the end of closest. Well, another problem with their test is it's called end of year, administered normally in March. That's like a 4-year degree measured by full-time equivalent students. We measure degree completion in college by 6 years. Well, what the heck? Why don't we just call it a 6-year degree and be honest? I mean, this is the system. These games that are played all the time are a joke. And so the end of year test ought to be at the end of the year. I think school districts ought to be limited on the number of tests to prepare for that test. That's not necessarily a leading indicator of us learning the material that's expected is the best way to do well on a test. Not retaking, doing rote tests over and over again. That's not going to help. But school districts feel compelled to do that, and that's just completely inappropriate. So fewer tests, end-of-year tests would be helpful, and we now have increasing amounts of technologies to make that possible. And I would say it should be more diagnostic as well. So, I mean, any parent that gets a test score back, they have no clue what it means. Level 3. Like, okay, great. I want to know what is my kid missing in math? What concepts don't they not know? What are their struggles in reading? What can I do over the summer to make sure they get back on track? That test should be given to the parent in plain spoken English about what that means for that child. and what you can do to make sure your child reaches a God-given ability. And then the final part of the loop ought to be that the outgoing teacher needs to know, and there should be remediation if it's like a chronic problem. How did I mess up? Maybe there are things that I need to learn how to do to make sure that if 50 of the students that were learning from me, 45 of them missed this concept, it's on me. What can I do to improve my caliber of teaching? And if I need remediation, then I need to go get help, and the school district ought to be able to give that. And then the incoming teacher ought to be able to get this information, so you're not spending the first month in August or September redoing what was, dealing with the atrophy of the summer, basically, that you can begin the process of accelerating knowledge early. So the test can play a critical role in this, but it ought to be a very different form of testing than what we have now. Does that make sense? I mean,
it does. And
states are looking at this, and I think that'd be a place where everybody gets hot and bothered politically about testing. Kids break out in acne, they break out in a rash, or they get acne. It's like crazy stuff to talk. They throw up and all this.
Yeah.
Let's make it less stressful, but make it more diagnostic and more helpful. I don't think, that's a place where there's probably common ground amongst left, right, Republican, Democrats, moms, dads, unions. I think everybody could agree that may be a place to work.
Yeah, I grew up taking these tests and never liking them. And I remember it was the Iowa standard, or the Iowa whatever, for many years. I didn't ever throw up or anything. I just didn't like the people of Iowa for many years. That's all that really happened.
You were not living in Minneapolis at the time, apparently.
No, I just thought the people in Iowa were torturers. I didn't really get it. So, what would a legislator who's sitting in here right now, though, go back and call this and start working on it? This thing around making sure that parents get smart, accurate, clear information about how their kids are doing.
It's called transparency. I mean, have you ever seen I think maybe it's required by the ESSA law. Maybe, Patricia, is it the requirement to advise parents of how schools are doing? Have you ever looked at what schools have? I think Georgia probably has a better idea there. There's places that are looking at this. Most of them, it's a PowerPoint presentation. It's hard to find on the website. No one knows to go to the DOE, .org or whatever. It's totally untransparent. So I think one of the easy things for legislatures to do is to say, we're going to require that every parent get this in their language, normally English. This is how your schools did. And add this element of the diagnostic tool. There's this new thing called artificial intelligence. I get it for like my fantasy football.
Yeah.
Do you guys get fantasy football when I'm 2-7, just for the record. And every Monday or Tuesday after Monday Night Football, I get a AI-driven narrative about how I suck as a coach. And it's in English for everybody to understand. It's humiliating against my fellow, competitors. Doc Square, I think my team is called, is just a horrible team, and the coach keeps making the wrong mistakes. Well, take this groovy new thing called AI and apply it in a positive way to be able to provide in a narrative form in plain spoken English the information for a parent, not only how their school's doing, but how their kid is doing. That is not science fiction. That's not out into the future. That could be done today, and it doesn't require a ton of money. And that transparency and linking student learning to parent empowerment, I think what you'll find over time is that parents will begin to demand that they have a say about their child's education. They won't be pushed away anymore. And that's the first step of providing more choices for parents so their students can thrive.
You have said that all education is local, and the most local you could possibly get is at the parent level.
Yeah.
Oftentimes it doesn't feel that way. As a parent activist, as people working with, people in power are supposed to make decisions for us. What would you say about the empowerment of parents reasserting their power?
It's essential for success. You think about kids with learning disabilities. And when I ran and I went to visit 250 schools, the parents that came to see me more often than not were parents of exceptional ed kids, because they were fighting school districts back then in Florida like nobody's business. They'd be dealing with lawyers from the school district saying, my individual education plan, my IEPs, my child's IEP is not being met. And there'd be a big fight, and they would resist, and they would fight back. And they'd give up because they didn't have the power to make choices. When I saw that over and over again, the first idea that came to mind, and thankfully the Florida legislature was totally in on this, was to say, okay, if a parent, if they believe their IEPs, the child's IEP is not being met, they should be able to go to any school in the community, any school. They make that choice. They have the power to do it, and the state and local dollars ought to go. I think the federal dollars ought to go as well with that parent to any school that they decide. And now 20 years later, we have 30,000 kids going to private schools based on this notion that this should not be a negotiation between a lawyer and a parent about their child that has challenges that can be incredibly severe to moderate, but they need to have different kind of approach, and the parents should make that decision. Why is that such a radical idea when every other aspect of our life, parents are empowered to make these choices? Whether they're in poverty or not, they can choose the doctor, they can choose the supermarket. They're not assigned, all these different things like we are in our school districts. And for whatever reason, there's this idyllic notion that public education has to be the way it was 100 years ago, because it worked back then, and it did. But man, that's kind of oblivious to the whole fact is life has changed radically. And the bigger challenge isn't where we came from. The bigger challenge is, what's the world look like 10 years from now? What's the world look like for a kid in kindergarten and first grade today? What's their life look like when they graduate, if they do, from high school? Is that going to have any validity? Is that going to have value? Are they going to have other choices? Can you design a system that says, we're going to assure that every kid graduates from high school college ready and career ready with college credit under their belt, and the beginning of the journey of a career, not to be tracked that way, but be able to have a nationally recognized, high quality certificate that connotes that there is tremendous value in the work that you've done. That we shouldn't dumb it all down to make sure that we have a third of our kids college and or career ready. We should elevate all of this. We could do that if you start focusing on the fact that there is a kindergartner in any part of the country today that probably won't ever get a job unless we redesign how our education system works. And I don't think that's a left-right issue. It shouldn't be a partisan issue. It's a national challenge that we've been up to it in the past. The question is America up to it today?
Yeah, I love how you always say, it shouldn't be a radical idea, and then you follow that by a radical idea.
These aren't radical ideas. God, I don't know. I'm not a radical. Look at me. I'm not. I
think you're pretty radical.
It's, the politicians now use the word common sense a lot. It seems like everything's common sense. That's what this is.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's the ticket.
I like to tell people good sense is uncommon.
It's commonsensical.
So I would be remiss to leave without saying this. You have another vision now as time is moving on. It's like, I think we agree on, if you're a kid in a school for 12 years, you should graduate capable of doing something, right? You should either college, career, something. Where are we missing the boat on the connection between workforce development, education, those systems?
This is a place of great, where we should all be optimistic, frankly, because this is the happy intersection in political policy world where tricycles go by, not big Mack trucks designed to flatten you. There is a broad bipartisan consensus, put aside DC, because they could be a really important partner in this, to move to career, pathways. Not the tracking kind of idea of VOTEC of 50 years ago, but where you get, particularly in high school, where the high school experience becomes pretty boring pretty quick. And a lot of kids get turned off. 25% of kids, based on a study that came out last year by a think tank, 25% of juniors could take college level work. And a lot of young people would be excited about learning English and math and science if it embedded in that was a career orientation, something that they were passionate about. Doesn't mean that they're going to be doing that 15 years from now, but why wouldn't we want to redesign the system to embed in the learning experience both college readiness and career pathways to get people excited? There is massive amount of support for this. And so the question is, how do you fund it? You have these silos, how do you create, and this is where, child-centered funding really matters, where parents can make these choices rather than the silos of community college, VOTEC, and traditional K-12. If we turn the system on its head and the money followed the child, you could have an incredibly dynamic 21st century education system that would be more career-oriented. And kids' passions could be elevated to the proper place. In my experience of talking to young people, some of them are extraordinarily excited, and they should be given high-level work. It doesn't matter, you could have a high school where you have kids of the same age in a classroom where some are taking AP physics and other things like that and are getting college credit, and others are learning things that may not require a four-year degree, may require an AS degree or an AA degree, or maybe just require a certificate that says, certification that says that you're ready to work. And they could grow up socially together, but they all could have varying interests. And that requires turning the system on its head, where time is the variable, learning's the constant, and you have an array of things that are offered to these kids.
Say that again, time is say that last part again.
Let's see if I got it right. Did I mess it up?
Time, no, you got it right.
Time is the variable, learning's the constant.
Yeah, see, that's radical. I don't know why people say these are radical. That is radical. That's very good.
That's commonsensical.
It is.
Think about it. It's if you had a homogenized student population that, the range of learning was like this, okay, everybody sit in front of a teacher, teach to the median, basically teach everything the way it's been taught for 30 years before. That worked. Now we have this incredibly diverse student population, and it's not just in California, Texas, and Florida. Everybody in this room knows the emerging populations in every state are creating a diverse student population.
Yeah.
And that should be something that we celebrate, not be threatened by. We should say, hallelujah, diversity is our strength. But then we have to challenge, okay, so these are kids with diverse needs. In Florida, 60+% of students are qualified for free and reduced lunch, or majority minority, 55% are qualified for reduced and free lunch. Are we gonna say, well, that looks exactly how it looked a long time ago? No, it's changed. So a system that's designed on customizing the learning experience with the tools we have today that exist, that didn't exist even a decade ago, needs to be the path forward. And a lot of teachers would be inspired by this because they're tired of doing it the old way. They're frustrated because they know if you just teach to the median the way it was taught 50 years ago, it's not going to work.
I want to thank you. This has been an honor for me. You are like the Tesla of good education policy. But I should say,
Tesla.
Not the Tesla. I should now say the Ford Mustang EV electronic vehicle.
Exactly. I would take that one. I've also saw. I'm waiting. It's a little. I was watching football and the Volkswagen bus.
Yeah.
I'm a child of the '60s and '70s. The VW bus is coming back as an electric bus. Cool looking. I may hold out for that. Back to the future, baby.
You're the Mustang. Let's give it up for, I always like to start and end in the same place. I know what we agree on is that every child is born with unsurpassable worth given to them by a mighty God. Exactly. I love to see it in my leaders when they believe that. And you truly believe that. Thank you, thank you, thank you for everything you do.
Thank you, Chris.
Thank you.
Thanks, man.
Thanks, sir.
Yeah, that was great.
Thank you.
You did really good at this.
Thanks, sir.